January 24th, 1945. 50 German soldiers collapse in the snow near Colmar, France, not from rifle fire, but from artillery strikes so precise they seem impossible. German commanders scan the frozen fields desperately, searching for the forward observer directing this deadly rain of steel. They find nothing.
No foxhole. No bunker.
No American position. Just empty winter ground. But someone is out there. Someone who can see them. Someone who learned to disappear as a child. Hunting turkeys in Kentucky Hollow, someone lying in a drainage ditch 30 centimeters deep. So close that German boots pass within arm's reach. And in less than an hour, this invisible man will make the most terrifying decision of his life, ordering American artillery to fire directly on his own position. How did a 120-pound farmer become the soldier who saved an entire battalion? This is his story. The hills of eastern Kentucky in the 1920s taught a boy everything he would need to survive the worst war in human history, though he didn't know it then. Garlin Murl Conner learned to hunt not for sport but for survival, in a landscape where the difference between eating and going hungry often came down to a single shot from a borrowed rifle. His family's farm clung to rocky soil that yielded more sweat than corn, and winter meant hunger unless you could bring home meat. The Depression hadn't officially arrived yet, but poverty had lived in those hills for generations, patient and permanent as the limestone beneath the topsoil. The boy was small even then, compact and wiry, built for endurance rather than power. He would never grow much past 5 feet 5 inches, never weigh more than 120 pounds soaking wet. But size meant nothing in the woods. What mattered was stillness. What mattered was patience. What mattered was the ability to become part of the landscape itself, to disappear so completely that a wild turkey would walk past you at 10 feet without noticing your presence. Garlin's father taught him to hunt the way his father had taught him, not with words but with demonstration and correction. You learned by watching, by failing, by trying again. The first lesson was breathing, controlled, shallow, silent. A deer could hear a nervous breath from 50 yards. The second lesson was stillness, true stillness, the kind where your muscles locked into position and stayed there despite the screaming protests of your body. Where a mosquito could land on your neck and drink its fill while you remained motionless, because motion meant failure, and failure meant hunger. The third lesson, the hardest lesson, was patience. Waiting could take hours, sometimes all day. You found your position before dawn and you held it, watching, barely blinking, while the sun crawled across the sky and your legs went numb and your back ached and your mind tried to trick you into moving, into giving up, into going home. But you didn't move. You waited, because the turkey or the deer would come eventually if you could just outlast your own discomfort, outlast your own mind. There was a fourth lesson too, one that nobody could teach directly. It was something you either learned or you didn't. It was the ability to see without being seen, to observe without revealing yourself, to gather information while remaining invisible. It was a kind of battlefield awareness before Garlin Conner ever knew what a battlefield was. You tracked not just the animal but everything around it, the wind direction, the light, the terrain, the escape routes, the angles of approach. You built a complete picture in your mind and you held it there, updating it constantly, adapting to every change. By the time he was 16, Garlin could ghost through autumn woods without disturbing a single leaf. He could hold position in a cold November rain for 6 hours without shivering. He could judge distance by eye alone and compensate for wind and elevation instinctively. He could slow his heart rate and breathing until he was barely alive, just another feature of the landscape. These were not military skills. They were survival skills. But one day they would become the same thing. The years passed the way they do in poor rural communities. Slowly, each season identical to the last, each harvest barely enough, each winter a test of endurance. Garlin married a local girl named Pauline in 1941. He was 21 years old and had never been more than 50 miles from the farm where he was born. He had no particular ambitions beyond providing for his wife, working the land, maybe raising children who would have slightly easier lives than he'd had. The wider world barely existed for him. He knew vaguely that there was a war happening somewhere in Europe, that the Germans and the British were fighting, that it probably didn't concern him. Then December 7th, 1941, arrived like a thunderclap. Pearl Harbor, the radio crackling with news that seemed impossible. America was at war. Garlin listened to the reports in his small farmhouse and understood immediately that his life had just changed forever. He didn't wait to be drafted. Within weeks, he enlisted in the United States Army. It wasn't patriotism exactly, though he loved his country in the quiet way that rural people do, through actions rather than words. It was simpler than that. His country needed him, and he had never been the kind of man to shirk a duty. The Army took one look at Garlin Murl Conner, 5 feet 5 inches, 120 pounds, Kentucky accent thick as creek mud, and saw nothing special. He was assigned to the infantry, the grunts, the expendable ones. They issued him a uniform that hung loose on his small frame and a rifle that seemed too large for his hands. They shouted at him in basic training, tried to break him down and rebuild him, but there was nothing to break. Garlin had been enduring discomfort his entire life. A drill sergeant's insults meant nothing to a man who'd spent 16-hour days plowing rocky soil. The long marches meant nothing to someone who'd tracked deer through 20 miles of mountain terrain. The dawn wake-up calls meant nothing to a hunter who'd been rising at 4 a.m. since he was 10 years old. But the real training, the important training, happened when he was assigned to the 3rd Infantry Division and began learning how to call artillery fire. Forward observers were specialists who positioned themselves close to enemy lines, sometimes beyond friendly lines, and directed artillery strikes by radio or telephone. It required an almost supernatural ability to judge distance, to read terrain, to stay calm under fire, to remain hidden while observing enemy movements. It required exactly the skills that Garlin had spent his entire childhood developing in the Kentucky woods. He took to it immediately, naturally. While other soldiers struggled with range estimation and coordinate calculation, Garlin simply looked at the landscape and knew. The same eyes that had tracked Turkey movements through dense forest could now track German troop movements across open ground. The same patience that had allowed him to outweight a cautious deer now allowed him to remain motionless while enemy patrols passed within meters of his position. The same stillness that had made him invisible to wild animals now made him invisible to trained soldiers. By the time the 3rd Infantry Division shipped out to North Africa in late 1942, Garlin Conner had transformed from a Kentucky farmer into something else entirely. He was a weapon, a precise, patient, deadly weapon wrapped in a small, unassuming package. North Africa taught him what war actually was. Not the heroic narratives from recruitment posters, but the grinding, exhausting, terrifying reality. The heat that could kill you as surely as any bullet. The flies that swarmed over everything. The dysentery that left men shaking and weak. The German 88mm artillery pieces that could drop a shell on your position before you even heard the gun fire. The Stuka dive bombers that screamed out of the sun like mechanical demons. The random, arbitrary nature of death, how a man standing next to you could be alive one moment and torn apart the next, for no reason at all, pure chance, pure chaos. Garlin was wounded for the first time in Tunisia. Shrapnel from a mortar round tore through his left shoulder, spinning him around and dropping him into the sand. The pain was immediate and overwhelming, but beneath the pain was a colder realization. This was just the beginning. He was patched up and sent back to his unit within a week. There was always a shortage of experienced forward observers. Men in that role tended to die quickly. Sicily came next, in July 1943. The invasion was chaos. Landing craft hung up on sandbars, men drowning under the weight of their equipment, German artillery turning the beaches into killing zones. Garlin made it ashore and pushed inland with his unit, calling fire missions that saved American lives and took German ones. He was wounded again, this time by small arms fire that punched through his right thigh. He kept fighting, kept calling coordinates, until blood loss forced him to accept evacuation. 2 weeks later he was back. Italy nearly killed him. The Italian campaign was a nightmare of mountains and mud, of German positions that seemed impossible to dislodge, of attacks that gained meters at the cost of dozens of lives. Monte Cassino, Anzio, the Gothic Line, names that would haunt survivors for the rest of their lives. Garlin was wounded 3 more times in Italy, once by artillery, once by machine gun fire, once by a mine fragment that should have killed him but instead left him with scars across his back that would never fully heal. Each time he recovered and returned. His commanders stopped being surprised. Conner always came back. By the time the 3rd Infantry Division landed in southern France in August 1944, Garlin Conner had spent 26 months in continuous combat. 26 months of violence and death and fear. 26 months of watching friends die, of killing men he'd never met, of living in a state of constant alertness that wore down the mind and body like water wearing down stone. He had been wounded 5 times. He had earned a Silver Star, a Bronze Star, and multiple Purple Hearts. He had probably killed more enemy soldiers than he could count, though he never spoke about it. He should have been dead. By any reasonable calculation, he should have been dead a dozen times over. The statistical probability of surviving that long as a forward observer, as someone who deliberately positioned himself between American and German lines, was nearly 0. But Garlin kept surviving. Not through luck, though luck played its part, but through skill. Through the same skills he'd learned hunting in Kentucky. Through stillness and patience and the ability to become invisible. The Vosges Mountains in eastern France tested every survivor skill he possessed. The terrain was vertical, heavily forested, perfect for German defensive positions. The weather was brutal. Cold rain that turned to sleet, then snow, soaking through uniforms and turning foxholes into freezing pools of mud. Men got trench foot so badly their boots had to be cut off, taking skin with them. Garlin pushed forward with his unit, calling fire missions in conditions that made simple survival an achievement. He was wounded again in November, his 6th wound, this time in the hip, a bullet that went through muscle and chipped bone but missed anything vital. He was evacuated to a field hospital near the town of Colmar in Alsace, that disputed region that had been passed back and forth between France and Germany for centuries and now found itself German again, briefly, desperately, as the Reich collapsed. The field hospital was a commandeered building, maybe a school or a town hall once, now filled with cots and groaning men and the overwhelming smell of blood and antiseptic and gangrene. Garlin lay on a cot with his hip bandaged, staring at the ceiling, listening to the distant rumble of artillery. The wound wasn't that bad, relatively speaking. He'd had worse. The doctors said he'd need a month of rest, maybe more. They said his war was probably over. They said he'd done enough. But Garlin Conner wasn't a man who measured duty by what was enough. And on the morning of January 24, 1945, duty came calling again. The sound of artillery fire changed. Not the regular background rumble that you learn to tune out, but something closer, more urgent. Then came small arms fire, the distinctive rattle of German MG-42 machine guns, faster than any weapon should fire, a sound like tearing fabric amplified 1,000 times. Then shouting. American voices. Frantic. Someone running through the hospital wards. We're under attack. Heavy attack. Garlin sat up despite the screaming protest from his hip. Through the window he could see smoke rising from American positions. The tactical situation became clear immediately. The Germans were launching a major counterattack, trying to break through American lines before the final Allied push into Germany. His battalion, the 3rd Battalion of the 7th Infantry Regiment, was out there. His unit, his people. He stood, testing the wounded hip. It held. Barely, but it held. He found his uniform, pulled it on with shaking hands. Found his boots. A medic saw him and rushed over. Conner, what the hell are you doing? You're wounded. My unit's under attack. That's not your problem right now. You need to rest, you need to. But Garlin was already moving, limping toward the exit. He found a field telephone and a spool of wire, the tools of his trade. He found his Thompson submachine gun, checked the magazine, slung it over his shoulder. Every movement sent spikes of pain through his hip, but pain was just information, just a signal, and he'd learned long ago how to acknowledge it and move forward anyway. Outside, the world had transformed into chaos. American forces were pulling back from forward positions under withering German fire. Artillery shells were walking across the landscape, plowing up frozen earth and sending geysers of snow and soil into the gray sky. Machine gun fire raked the fields. Garlin could see the tactical situation at a glance. The Germans were advancing in force, at least a battalion-strength attack, maybe 600 infantry supported by armor. Tiger tanks, probably the massive German behemoths that could shrug off most American anti-tank weapons. His battalion needed a forward observer. Someone who could get close enough to the German advance to call accurate fire missions. Someone who could direct the American artillery that was their only real defense against this kind of overwhelming attack. Without accurate artillery, the battalion would be overrun. It was that simple. Garlin started running. The distance between the field hospital and the American forward positions was roughly 365 meters across open ground. Open ground that was currently being swept by German artillery and machine gun fire. Ground where anything moving became a target instantly. It was suicide to cross it. Everyone knew it was suicide to cross it. That's why no one else was doing it. Garlin ran anyway, the telephone spool in one hand, unreeling wire behind him as he went. The wire served two purposes. It would allow him to call fire missions once he reached a forward position, and it created a physical trail he could follow back through the smoke and chaos if he survived. Artillery shells were impacting all around him now. Not aimed at him specifically, he was too small, too insignificant, but part of the general bombardment, random, impersonal death falling from the sky. He ran through the narrow spaces between explosions, his small size suddenly an advantage, less target area, harder to hit. The wounded hip screamed at him with every step, but he ignored it, focused on the ground ahead, on the gaps in the fire, on survival. Machine gun bullets cracked past him. Supersonic? Invisible? Missing by meters or centimeters or not missing at all? He couldn't tell. Didn't have time to check. He just ran, keeping low, the wire unreeling behind him like Theseus's thread leading out of the labyrinth. Except this labyrinth was trying actively to kill him. He covered the distance in less than 2 minutes, though it felt like hours. He reached the American forward line, really just a series of hasty foxholes and shell craters, and kept going. Because the forward line wasn't forward enough. To call accurate fire on the German advance, he needed to be ahead of the American positions. He needed to be between the two armies. He found what he was looking for about 30 meters beyond the American foxholes. An irrigation ditch, probably dug to drain water from the agricultural fields that had once grown here, back when this land had been farmland instead of a battlefield. The ditch was shallow, barely 30 centimeters deep, just a crease in the frozen earth. But it would have to do. Garlin lowered himself into the ditch and went still. Completely still. The same stillness he'd learned waiting for turkeys in Kentucky, the stillness where you stopped being a human and became just another feature of the landscape. He arranged himself carefully, the telephone within easy reach, the Thompson beside him, his body flat against the frozen earth. He covered himself with loose snow and debris, breaking up his outline. Then he waited. The German advance was visible now, clearly visible. Waves of infantry in their distinctive field gray uniforms, moving forward in coordinated groups, using cover effectively, professional soldiers doing what they'd been trained to do. Behind them, the enormous silhouettes of Tiger tanks, each one a rolling fortress of armor and firepower. 600 men and multiple tanks advancing on an American battalion that had maybe 300 effectives and no armor support. Garlin picked up the telephone handset and cranked it. The line was still good, the wire he'd run still intact. A voice crackled through. Fire control, identify yourself. This is Staff Sergeant Conner, 3rd Battalion, 7th Infantry. I have eyes on enemy advance, approximately battalion strength with armor support. Stand by for fire mission. There was a pause. Then, Conner? Where the hell are you? We have you listed as wounded, in hospital. I'll explain later. Right now, I need you to listen very carefully to these coordinates. He began calling the fire mission. Years of experience allowed him to judge distances by eye, to account for terrain and wind, to translate what he saw into numbers that would guide the artillery shells to their targets. The first rounds were ranging shots, meant to bracket the target and allow for adjustment. Garlin watched them impact, one long, one short. He made corrections. The next salvo was perfect. Artillery shells screamed down into the advancing German infantry, and suddenly men were falling, torn apart by shrapnel, the neat formations dissolving into chaos. Garlin kept his voice steady, kept calling coordinates, walking the artillery fire along the German line like a farmer plowing a field. But the Germans weren't retreating. They'd been in this war too long. taken too much ground through too much blood to fall back at the first resistance. They kept advancing, and now they were getting close. 50 meters. 40. Garlin could see their faces now, young faces and old faces, scared faces and determined faces, men who probably had families back in Germany, who'd probably rather be anywhere but here. But they were here, and they were advancing, and he was the only thing standing between them and his battalion. He kept calling fire missions, kept directing the artillery. More Germans fell. The snow around them was turning red, churned up by explosions and blood. But still they came. 30 meters now. 20. Close enough that Garlin could hear them shouting to each other in German, coordinating their advance. And then they were right on top of him. German infantry were passing within 5 meters of his position, some even closer. One soldier stopped to catch his breath less than 2 meters from where Garlin lay in the shallow ditch, so close that Garlin could see the steam of his breath, could see the weariness in his face, could see the iron cross pinned to his uniform. The German stood there for 30 seconds that lasted a lifetime, and Garlin didn't breathe, didn't blink, didn't exist. He was stone. He was earth. He was invisible. The German moved on, never seeing him. For the next 3 hours, Garlin Conner lay motionless in that 30-centimeter ditch, while 600 German soldiers and their supporting tanks flowed past him and around him and sometimes nearly over him. He kept calling artillery strikes, kept directing fire with surgical precision. German casualties mounted. 50 dead. 70. More wounded, screaming, being dragged back by their comrades. The Tiger tanks were having trouble in the broken terrain, their weight causing them to bog down in the soft earth that artillery had churned up. But the Germans kept pressing, and now they were so close that American artillery couldn't engage them without hitting their own positions. The fire control officer's voice crackled through the telephone. "Conner, we can't fire any closer without endangering the battalion. You need to pull back." Garlin looked at the Germans surrounding his position, looked at the American line behind him, already starting to buckle under the pressure. Made a calculation that required either perfect courage or perfect madness, though maybe those were the same thing. Made a decision that would define the rest of his life, however long that turned out to be. He keyed the telephone. "Fire on my position." Silence on the other end. Then, "Say again." "You heard me. Blanket my position with everything you've got. Do it now." "Conner, you'll be." "I know what I'll be." "Do it." "That's an order." There was protocol, technically, about who could give orders to whom, but in that moment none of it mattered. The fire control officer understood what Garlin was saying, what he was asking for. Understood that this small Kentucky farmer was volunteering to die if it meant stopping the German advance. Acknowledged. Rounds incoming. "God be with you, Conner." Garlin had perhaps 30 seconds before the shells arrived. He pressed himself as flat as possible into the shallow ditch, pressed his face into the frozen earth, and prayed. Not elaborate prayers, not theological arguments with the divine, just the simple, desperate prayer of men in combat. "Please, please let me live. Please let this work." The first shells hit like the end of the world. High explosive shells and white phosphorus rounds detonated directly on Garlin's position, turning the ground around him into hell manifest. The sound was beyond sound, beyond anything the human nervous system was designed to process. The concussion wave felt like being hit by a truck. Then hit again, then hit again. Shrapnel whined through the air inches above the ditch. The pressure pulped the ground, liquefying frozen earth into mud. Heat and smoke and chemical fire engulfed everything. Garlin couldn't hear anymore, couldn't see, couldn't think, could only endure second by second as American artillery pounded his position. Around him, German soldiers were dying, torn apart by the barrage they hadn't seen coming, that couldn't be coming, that made no sense because there was an American in that killing zone. Why would the Americans fire on their own man? But Garlin wasn't dying. Not yet. The shallow ditch that had seemed like inadequate cover was, by pure chance and perfect positioning, just deep enough. The shells were detonating at ground level or slightly above, and the ditch, barely 30 centimeters, barely a foot, was just enough to keep him below the horizontal spray of shrapnel. Just enough to keep him in a tiny pocket of space where physics and probability hadn't quite managed to kill him yet. The barrage lasted 8 minutes. 480 seconds. Each one an eternity. Each one a separate negotiation with death. Garlin lost all sense of time, all sense of self. He existed only as a small point of consciousness drowning in noise and violence and terror, holding on to existence by the thinnest possible thread. And then, impossibly, it was over. The shells stopped falling. The world fell into a ringing, cotton-wrapped silence broken only by moaning and the crackle of fires. Garlin lay in the ditch, not sure if he was alive or dead, not sure of anything. His ears were bleeding. His nose was bleeding. Every exposed inch of skin felt sandblasted. But his heart was beating and his lungs were pulling in air, and that meant he was alive. He reached for the telephone with a hand that shook so badly he could barely grip it. Cranked the handle. A voice, distant and tinny. "Fire control." Garlin's voice came out as a croak. "This is Conner.
I'm alive."
Enemy formation broken. Retreating. Adjust fire to pursuit coordinates. Dead silence on the other end. Then something that might have been a sob or a laugh. "Jesus Christ, Conner. We thought you were dead." "Not yet. Stand by for fire mission." For the next 30 minutes, as the German attack fell apart and the surviving soldiers retreated, Garlin called artillery fire on their withdrawal routes, making the retreat as costly as the advance had been. When it was finally over, when the battlefield had gone quiet except for the cries of the wounded, he climbed out of his ditch and began following his telephone wire back toward American lines. He made it 50 meters before his legs gave out. The adrenaline that had kept him functioning drained away all at once, and he collapsed into the snow. Soldiers from his battalion found him there 15 minutes later, curled in a ball, shaking, unable to walk. They carried him back to the aid station on a stretcher. The butcher's bill came in over the next hours. The German attack, 600 infantry and tank support, had been completely destroyed as an effective fighting force. 51 Germans confirmed dead in the field around Garlin's position alone. More than 100 wounded. The tanks forced to withdraw without infantry support. The American battalion had held. Not a single position had been overrun. One man had done that. One small man in a shallow ditch with a telephone, and the patients learned hunting turkeys in Kentucky. The Army awarded Garlin Murl Conner the Distinguished Service Cross, second only to the Medal of Honor, for his actions that day. But the recommendation for the Medal of Honor itself got lost in the administrative chaos of a war entering its final months. It would take 70 years, 7 decades, before a dedicated historian uncovered the evidence, before the testimony of the men Garlin saved that day reached the right ears, before President Barack Obama draped the Medal of Honor around the neck of Garlin Conner's widow in 2018, 73 years late, but finally acknowledging what that small Kentucky farmer had done. Garlin survived the war, though survived is perhaps too simple a word for what he endured. 7 wounds in 28 months of continuous combat. 7 separate times when death had reached for him and barely missed. The physical scars would never fully heal. The hip wound from Alsace would ache for the rest of his life, a daily reminder of January 24, 1945. But the deeper scars, the ones that couldn't be seen, those were worse. He returned to Kentucky after the war, to Pauline, to the farm, to the life he'd left behind. But the man who came home wasn't quite the same man who'd left. How could he be? He'd seen things, done things, endured things that no human should have to see or do or endure. He'd killed men. He'd watched friends die. He'd volunteered to be killed himself because it was the only tactical choice that made sense. He never talked about the war much. When asked, he'd shrug and change the subject. The few times he did speak about it, his words were simple, matter-of-fact, stripped of heroism or glory. "I did what needed doing," he'd say. Or, "Someone had to do it," as if calling artillery fire on his own position was the moral equivalent of plowing a field or fixing a fence, just another task that needed completing. He and Pauline lived quietly. He worked different jobs over the years, nothing glamorous, nothing that paid well, but honest work. He raised 4 children. He went to church on Sundays. He hunted sometimes, though less as the years went on, as if that connection to his past had become too complicated, too weighted with other associations. He was, by all external appearances, just another veteran getting on with life, just another man among millions who'd served and come home and tried to forget. But at night, sometimes Pauline would wake to find him staring at the ceiling. Not sleeping, not moving, just staring. And she understood without asking that he was back there. Back in that ditch, listening to the shells fall, calculating whether the next one would be the one that killed him. Reliving those 8 minutes when death had walked over him and around him and through him and somehow, impossibly, left him breathing. The recognition came late, too late for Garlin himself to receive it. He died in 1998 at the age of 79, never knowing that his actions would eventually be recognized with his nation's highest military honor. Never knowing that historians would call him one of the most effective soldiers of World War II. Never knowing that his story would be studied at West Point, that forward observers would learn his name, that people would still be talking about what he did on a frozen field in Alsace 7 decades later. But maybe he didn't need to know. Maybe the recognition had never been the point. The men of his battalion knew. The men he'd saved knew. They came home, those men, and lived lives and raised families and grew old, and all of it, was because a small Kentucky farmer had been willing to disappear into a shallow ditch and call death down upon himself. That was the legacy. Not medals or monuments but lives lived, children raised, futures that existed because of a choice made in impossible circumstances by a man who'd learned stillness and patience hunting in the hills of Kentucky, who'd learned that sometimes the only way to survive was to make yourself invisible, and who'd understood, when the moment came, that sometimes the only way to save others was to make yourself the target. On the morning of January 24, 1945, in a shallow irrigation ditch in Alsace, Garlin Murl Conner made himself invisible to 600 German soldiers and made himself the most important target on the entire battlefield. He did both simultaneously, perfectly, with a precision that was part training, part instinct, part something deeper that had no name. And when the artillery fire he'd called down on his own position finally lifted, when the smoke cleared and the impossible became real, he was still breathing, still calling coordinates, still doing what needed doing. The men he saved never forgot. They told their children and grandchildren about the small man with the telephone who'd stopped an entire German attack. They told anyone who would listen, though for decades it seemed no one in authority was listening. But they kept telling it anyway, kept the memory alive because some stories are too important to let die. This is one of those stories. This is the story of what courage looks like when stripped of everything except the raw, essential choice. To run toward danger when every instinct screams to run away. To call death down upon yourself because it's the only way to save others. To endure the unendurable and emerge on the other side fundamentally changed but still standing, still breathing, still human. Garlin Murl Conner never asked to be a hero. He was just a small man from Kentucky who knew how to be still, how to be patient, how to disappear. And on one frozen day in January 1945, those simple skills learned hunting turkeys in Depression-era hills became the skills that saved hundreds of American lives. He did what needed doing. Someone had to do it. And somehow, impossibly, beautifully, miraculously, he survived to come home. If you found this story as powerful as I did researching and writing it, please hit that subscribe button and give this video a like. It helps this incredible story reach more people who need to hear it. Here's a question I can't stop thinking about. Would you have had the courage to make the same choice Garlin Conner made? Could you have called artillery fire on your own position, knowing it might be the last decision you ever made? Drop your honest thoughts in the comments below. I read every single one. This is the kind of forgotten history that deserves to be remembered. Share it with someone who needs to hear a story about real courage, real sacrifice, real heroism stripped of Hollywood gloss and shown in its raw, terrifying, beautiful truth. Thank you for watching. Thank you for remembering. And thank you to Garlin Murl Conner, wherever you are, for showing us what it really means to be brave.